My name is Louise, and I'm turning 34 this year. After college, I started working at a big company that most people know about. The pay was good, even for beginners, but it came with some downsides. I had to travel a lot for work and often worked extra hours and on holidays. It was tough, but I felt it was worth it. By the time I was 28, I got promoted to department head, which was unusual for a woman. 4 years ago, I married my boyfriend Brian. We had met through a friend. I wasn't really interested in dating, but my friend thought I should meet him. I wasn't eager to get married, thinking I could be happy single. Brian, on the other hand, wanted to get married and have kids soon. I wasn't ready for that and thought it was strange to get married when we didn't know each other well, especially since I was focusing on my career. When Brian brought up marriage, I would say we needed more time. He suggested we could marry after dating for 2 years, thinking that would give us enough time to get to know each other. Surprisingly, we did stay together for 2 years and then got married. During our relationship, Brian was loyal, not a gambler, and generally kind. He was hardworking, but his big ego sometimes bothered me. For example, he would complain at home if a senior at work gave him feedback, even though it was clear he had made mistakes. He didn't handle criticism well. When it came time for us to have dinner with both families, Brian chose an expensive restaurant that cost over $200 per person. He asked me to pay half of the total bill. I suggested a cheaper place, but Brian insisted that the expensive restaurant was important. He said if we went somewhere cheaper, it would make him look stingy. He couldn't afford to cover the whole bill, so he asked me to pay more than half, which I wasn't happy about. We had 4 people from each family, making a total of 8. Brian chose a restaurant that cost over $200 per person, even though he couldn't afford to cover his family's share. I wasn't thrilled about his choice and was even more confused when he told everyone at the dinner not to worry about the bill because he'd take care of it. Everyone seemed happy, so I decided to let him handle it, though I was unsure about it at the time. Looking back, I regret not reconsidering the marriage. After we got married, Brian's attitude changed. He started talking down to me and stopped helping with household chores, even though he had promised to. He began making excuses like, "What will the neighbors think if they see a man doing laundry? Chores are a woman's job." He insisted on relaxing at home while I did all the work. What really upset me was that Brian was constantly sending money to his parents. They were struggling with farming, and since they were nearing their 70s, it was getting harder for them to make a living. At first, I understood why he was helping them, but within 6 months of our marriage, it became a regular strain. Brian started giving all his salary to his parents and wouldn't contribute any money for our living expenses. I told him it was ridiculous to expect me to cover everything with my salary alone. He responded by saying, "How can you say that when my family is in trouble? They're your family too. Besides, you make more money than I do, so you should manage just fine." On the phone with his parents, Brian always said, "Don't worry, I'm taking care of everything with my salary. I won't let her complain about it." It seemed like he was sending just part of his salary, but in reality, he was giving all of it to his parents. He had no money left for himself and started asking me for pocket money, saying, "Can you give me about $200? I can't even afford lunch." I decided I couldn't keep living like this and suggested setting a monthly limit on how much we send to his parents. I told him he needed to figure out how to cover his lunch expenses on his own. Brian agreed, but he continued sending his entire salary to his parents. That was something I couldn't tolerate. One day, I had to be away for a business trip for about 2 weeks. Brian complained, "What am I going to eat while you're gone? And what about my laundry?" Despite knowing my job required frequent travel, I was frustrated by his childishness and told him to figure it out himself. I suggested he could go stay with his family if he needed help. Brian reluctantly agreed. When I returned home 2 weeks later, I found Brian's sister, Elizabeth, at our house. She lived a bit further away, and we hadn't seen each other since our wedding. I was curious about her presence. When I got home, Elizabeth greeted me with a big smile, saying, "Hi Louise, it's been a while." "Oh, and the money, you were a lifesaver. Thank you so much." She was so cheerful that I didn't even have time to unpack my luggage before asking her, "Money? What are you talking about?" Elizabeth replied without hesitation, "Brian said since you have some savings, he'd use them as startup capital for my business. He mentioned that you had at least $1 million saved up." Just then, Brian walked in, holding my passbook and seal. As soon as he saw me, he said, "Oh, welcome back. Perfect timing. I'm going to give your savings to Elizabeth. You know she's a nail artist and has always wanted her own shop. She's been saving up, but she's about $1 million short. I remember that you have exactly $1 million saved, so I told her she could have it. He handed the passbook and seal to Elizabeth, smiling, and said, "You're lucky, this will help make your dream come true. Be grateful." I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer and snapped, "What are you talking about? That's my money. Why are you making this decision on your own? I'd understand if you wanted to lend it, but then there should be a promissory note and a repayment plan, but just giving it away without asking me?" I took the passbook and seal back from Elizabeth. Brian looked at me and said, "We're family, aren't we? It's ridiculous to need a promissory note for family members. Besides, we're not lending it, we're giving it. You don't even have a hobby because you're always working. It's a waste to just keep the money. Elizabeth has a dream. Don't you think it's more meaningful to use it to help her?" He glared at me as he finished speaking. I realized that Brian was someone I couldn't communicate with. Just as I was about to give up on the conversation, Brian said, "This money is too good for you. I'm giving it to Elizabeth because you'd only waste it. You can just work and save up again. If you want to keep arguing, we can get divorced." That gave me an idea. I quickly responded, "All right, let's get a divorce. I'll draft the divorce papers and send them to you. I'll come to pick up my things soon. Until the divorce is finalized, I'll stay at a hotel. Goodbye for now." With that, I grabbed my luggage from my business trip and left the house. Brian was shocked by my sudden decision, but he soon began sending multiple texts, saying things like, "You can still come back if you apologize now," and "Elizabeth says she'll forgive you if you give her the money. Stop being stubborn and come back." I ignored all his messages. The next day, I went to the city hall and mailed the signed divorce papers. Even then, Brian kept texting, asking if I was sure about this and telling me he was going to submit the papers. I simply replied, "Please submit them as soon as possible," and ignored the rest of his texts. The divorce was finalized sooner than I expected. A week later, while Brian was at work, I moved my things to my new place. When Brian texted me about submitting the divorce papers, he said, "I feel great being able to divorce an ugly woman like you. We are strangers now. Make sure you divide our property properly." I decided not to take most of the furniture and appliances. Instead, I deposited half of the small savings we had accumulated during our marriage into Brian's bank account and left it there. That night, I received numerous calls from Brian. At first, I ignored them, thinking it was just the beginning of his usual drama, but soon, Elizabeth also started calling me. Eventually, I answered the phone, and Brian immediately yelled, "What happened to dividing the property? This is ridiculous, there's only $800 in this account." I thought, just as I expected. I told him, "Look, I did divide the property. We originally had $1,600 in our joint account. I left you with half, so that's $800. All the furniture and appliances were bought after we got married, so I left them behind. That's a fair division, don't you think? I ended up with less than you." Brian wasn't convinced. He said, "What are you talking about? You should have had $1 million in savings, so half of that, $500,000, should be mine, and you got an inheritance from your grandpa, which should be half mine too." I was stunned and couldn't help but laugh. I had expected this. Otherwise, I don't think Brian would have agreed to the divorce so easily. I managed to stop laughing and explained, "Brian, property division is about marital assets. My savings from before we got married and my inheritance are not considered marital assets. I consulted a lawyer and divided our marital assets properly. The money we saved after marriage was all earned by me. Remember, you never contributed to our household expenses. Be grateful I even divided the savings." Brian insisted, "You're lying. There's no way that's true. Hand over the money properly, or I'll sue you." His voice was shaky with desperation. I calmly replied, "Go ahead, do what you need to do. If you want to pursue legal action, go ahead." I told Brian, "I haven't deceived you, and I divided the property fairly. I'm not afraid of being sued." Hearing this, Brian panicked and said, "Wait, let's forget about the divorce. I was wrong. Come back to me." He was backpedaling and asking for reconciliation. I replied, "What are you talking about? The divorce is finalized, and I have no intention of going back. This is not a joke. Since this is the end, let me tell you, if you plan to stay in the house, you need to pay the rent yourself. It's about $1,800 a month. You probably didn't know because you've never paid for it." Brian weakly responded, "There's no way I can afford that." I told him, "If you can't pay, then you need to leave. That's not my concern anymore." After that, it seems Brian went back to his parents' house because he couldn't afford the rent. To cover his moving expenses, he sold the furniture and appliances I had left behind. His parents, who thought he was making a decent amount of money, welcomed him warmly, expecting it would improve their situation. However, Brian couldn't give them as much money as he had when we were together, and he seemed uncomfortable living with them. Elizabeth, who had been preparing to start her own business with the money she expected from Brian, was forced to halt her plans when she didn't receive any of my savings. This setback caused her a lot of trouble, and Brian seemed to be having a hard time with her as well, but that was no longer my problem. I've been focusing on my work and enjoying living alone. I've had enough of marriage. Brian still sends messages saying he wants to get back together, but I completely ignore them. It's almost amusing to hear him update me on his situation from time to time, but I plan to block him soon.